Welcome to Hill Center at the Old Naval Hospital for the second annual Benjamin Drummond Emancipation Day celebration. So my name is Sharita Jacobs-Thompson, and I've had the honor to help organize this event for the past 2 years. And we have two scholars here that I'm going to introduce this afternoon. And so first we have Dr. Allyson Hobbs. Allyson Hobbs is an assistant professor in the Department of History at Stanford University. Allyson's first book, A Chosen Exile, A History of Racial Passing in American Life, published by Harvard University Press in October of 2014, examines the phenomenon of racial passing in the United States from the late 18th century to the present. A Chosen Exile won 2 prizes from the Organization of American Historians, the Frederick Jackson Turner Prize for Best First Book in American History, and the Lawrence Levine Prize for Best Book in American Cultural History. A Chosen Exile has been featured on All Things Considered on National Public Radio, Book TV on C-SPAN, the Melissa Harris Perry Show on MSNBC, and the Tavis Smiley Show on Public Radio International. A Chosen Exile has been reviewed in the New York Times Book Review, the San Francisco Chronicle, Harper's, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and the Boston Globe. The book was selected as the New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, a Best Book of 2014 by the San Francisco Chronicle, and the Book of the Week by the Times Higher Education in London. The root named A Chosen Exile is one of the best 15 nonfiction books by a Black author in 2014. Allyson graduated magna cum laude from Harvard University, and she received a PhD with distinction from the University of Chicago. Allyson's next book that we have to look forward to, Far from Sanctuary, African-American Travel on the Road to Civil Rights, explores the violence, humiliation, and indignities that African-American motorists experienced on the road. Jim Crow laws and local customs put mid-century American pleasures like taking to the road, exploring the country, and enjoying the freedom and autonomy of driving one's own car out of reach of Black drivers. This book is forthcoming from Harvard University Press in 2019. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
And our moderator for this afternoon is Professor Lisa Page. Lisa Page is a writer, instructor, and literary ambassador. She is co-editor of the forthcoming anthology, #Passing, which addresses racial, sexual, and economic passing. Her work has appeared in the Virginia Quarterly Review, American Short Fiction, Playboy, The Crisis, the Washington Post Book World, and other publications. She directs the creative writing program at George Washington University. She's vice president of the board of directors for the Penn Faulkner Foundation. She has interviewed writers for television, magazine, and public forums. She has taught writing at universities in Chicago, Washington, D.C., Virginia, and New Haven, Connecticut, as well as at a Maryland correctional facility. And she lives right outside of Washington, D.C. So, we're going to talk about the history of racial passing. Will you all please help me welcome our guests this afternoon?
So you were going to read the very beginning of this book to open things up for us.
I think that's exactly what I'll do, and I think what I'll do is I'll actually show a slide that I think will kind of set the tone a little bit for that. Oops, sorry for that. For the beginning of the book. So here we are. How many people here are from Chicago or have roots in Chicago? Okay. Great. Okay. So are you familiar? How many people are familiar with the Bud Billiken Parade? Okay, wonderful, great. Okay, so I'm going to read the first couple pages. And I think what I'll do is I'll actually start with the poem that begins the book, which is a poem by Langston Hughes, and then I'll read just a couple of pages. So this poem begins, and it reads, "On sunny summer Sunday afternoons in Harlem, when the air is one interminable ball game, and Grandma cannot get her gospel hymns from the saints of God in Christ on account of the Dodgers on the radio. On sunny Sunday afternoons, when the kids look all new and far too clean to stay that way, and Harlem has its washed and ironed and cleaned best out, the ones who crossed the line to live downtown miss you, Harlem of the bitter dream, since their dream has come true. Okay, and then I'm going to read just a few pages from the prologue. On a sizzling summer morning in the late 1930s, a young girl waited on the curb of South Park Boulevard on Chicago's South Side for the Bud Billiken parade to begin. The heat was relentless, but on the second Saturday in August, it made no difference to children who leapt from their beds in search of the best spot to view the parade. The young girl joined a crowd that numbered in the thousands, and she cheered as drum majors, baton twirlers, and celebrities in convertibles passed by. She ran out to the floats to touch the parade's anointed king and queen, and she caught the candy that the participants tossed to her. Beginning in 1929 as a celebration of the Chicago Defenders Newsboys, the Bud Billiken Parade later became a back-to-school celebration that honored all black children on the South Side. Known as the God of Things, as the way they should be, Bud Billiken was a mythical character that showered black children with affection. The parade was a South Side institution at a time when racial tensions ran high, when black families squeezed into overcrowded kitchenettes, and when black children knew not to venture beyond the boundaries of the Black Belt. The Bud Billiken Parade evoked a deep sense of race pride, community, and togetherness. For one day a year, black children could imagine that the city of Chicago was all theirs. The young girl could not have known that this would be her last time hearing the marching bands and the cheering crowds and following the parade to the picnic in Washington Park. Unlike many black parents, she would not share this experience with her children. She looked white, as did both of her parents. At the insistence of her mother, she would move far away from Chicago's South Side to Los Angeles to live the rest of her life as a white woman apart from her family. It was not her choice. She pleaded with her mother. She did not want to leave her family, her friends, and the only life that she had ever known. But her mother was determined, and the matter was decided. Years later, after she had married a white man and raised white children who knew nothing of her past, she received an inconvenient telephone call. It was her mother, and she called to tell her that her father was dying and that she must come home immediately. Despite these dire circumstances, she would never return to Chicago's South Side. The young girl who had once sat on a curb in Chicago's most historic black neighborhood to watch America's largest black parade was a white woman now, and there was simply no turning back. This book is about loss. Racial passing is an exile. sometimes chosen, sometimes not. The story of the young girl at the Bud Billiken Parade in Chicago is one of my family's stories, and one shared by thousands of other families. Between the late 18th and the mid-20th centuries, countless African Americans passed as white, leaving behind families, friends, and communities without any available avenue for return. Lives were lost, only to be remembered in family stories. This book is an effort to recover those lives.
Thank you. So this being the Benjamin Drummond Emancipation Day celebration, I want you to talk about how you talk about the history of passing in America, and how in antebellum times you refer to it as the bankruptcy of the race idea leading to passing, and then how you go into Reconstruction and opportunity.
Right, so part of what I'm trying to say is that we all sort of understand this idea of race being a social construction. And that is a complicated idea because we recognize how race isn't a category that has biological meaning, but yet when we say it's a social construction, it often feels like it has no meaning at all. And as we all know, race has lots of meaning in terms of how it affects our everyday lives. But what's interesting about passing is that it shows us that we've placed so much emphasis on racial identity and on race, yet when we look at people who pass, we realize that there really isn't, there really can't be that much meaning to it, because if you can pass as white, if it's possible for people to accept you as white, then what does race really mean? So when I say that there's that the idea of race is bankrupt, that's what I'm trying to get at. That if you can look white, and if people can accept you as white, particularly historically, then when we think about all of these laws and all of these efforts there were to keep blacks and whites separate, and all of these things that were done, and then we realize, well, there were whites that were passing there were blacks that were passing as white, and no one knew it, or people did know it, but this was happening all the time. And there's one story that I love to tell because it's so kind of humorous to me, where there was a man who was living as black, and he was involved in the 40s in sort of like an ROTC program. And he went to apply, and the white official looked at him and said, "Oh, this man is white." So when the white official filled out his form, he filled it out white. He wrote W. So the black man looks at his form and he says, "Oh, well, I guess I'm white now." I didn't know. And so he ends up getting placed at Old Miss. in 1946. So he goes down to Ole Miss as a white man, and he has a ball. He becomes the captain of the track team. He becomes, he's known as a good dancer. He's known as a loud talker. He protests when Senator Bilbo, who was a rabid segregationist, when he comes to the campus, he protests with other students who were against Senator Bilbo. And he just lives his life there as a white student. And then once the program is over, he transfers to Morehouse. So you have to wonder, well, you know, did the clerks say, oh, well, this is interesting. We've got a student who's transferring to Morehouse, which is a historically black college. Should we just not say anything and let that go, let this student go? Or did they even notice it? I mean, you know, we don't really know. But anyway, when James Meredith tried to integrate Ole Miss in 1961 and 1962, the campus explodes. And this man, his name was Harry S. Murphy, he says, you are fighting a battle that you don't realize you lost years ago. And the Ole Miss people say, wait a minute, what are you talking about? And he gets out his ID and he says, look, I was a student here in 1945 and 1946. And they say, what? Are you serious? And he says, yes. And they say, did you date white women? And he says, of course I did. You know, I was a student here. That's all the women that were here. Unless there were other black women passing, right? So anyway, you know, this idea that there's a way to actually police the color line, and that you can actually do that, and you can do it without any exceptions and without there being any, you know, mistakes or is just it's folly, you know. So that's what I'm trying to get at when I talk about, you know, how mistaken I think many people were. And then when I move into the period where I talk about Reconstruction, I'm talking about how with Reconstruction, there was a whole new set of possibilities. And African Americans with freedom, all of a sudden there's this possibility, well, maybe finally our economic and social and political rights will actually be respected. So maybe it's possible during Reconstruction that after emancipation, we'll be able to live as black and to have our rights be honored. So during Reconstruction, there's this sort of opening that happens of, you know, perhaps this is a new moment and a new period where some of these, where there's a sense of hopefulness and a sense of optimism that African Americans will finally receive some of the rights that they've been hoping
And
for.
opportunity, right? I mean, that's, unfortunately, that was short-lived, and once the Jim Crow laws came into being. So you talk about passing, you just told the story about this opportunity at Ole Miss, but you also talk about real loss in connection with passing. Would you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So the goal of my book is really to document the loss of passing, because I think that part of what we are more sort of accustomed to seeing, or something that we're more used to sort of talking about when we talk about passing, is what people gained. So I think we know that when people passed, they had better opportunities in terms of jobs, they had better opportunities in terms of where they could live, they had better opportunities in terms of social, the way that African Americans could be treated in terms of social dignities, being able to be called Mr. or Mrs., everything from where you could sit on a train to, where you could sit in a movie theater, that all of those kinds of things, which I think are not to be underestimated. Just your everyday, the kind of respect and the dignity that you could enjoy was much more. You could enjoy those types of things if you were living as a white person. But I think one thing that we don't talk about as much is what you lost when you passed as white. And part of what I try to do in my book is to look at what it meant to families, what it meant in terms of the separations, in terms of the alienation, the isolation, what it meant in terms of just the numerous forms of loss. So I didn't really think about this as much until I heard this story that I read to you at the very beginning. And this was a story that my aunt told me about this distant cousin of ours. And as my aunt was telling me this story, I was thinking about, what that must have felt like for her to hang up the phone with her mother and realize that she was never going to see her family again. That her father was dying, she would not see him again, she couldn't be with him while he was dying, she wasn't going to see her brothers again, just that whole range of losses. And it really made me look at passing differently. And it really made me think about all that passing, all of the losses, and also not only for the person who actually passes, but also for the entire family. So just as my cousin must have felt a deep sense of loss, I'm sure her mother felt, a tremendous sense of loss. I'm sure her father, the whole family felt a deep sense of loss. And that's why often passing is compared almost to death, because you're really estranged from the people who you're leaving behind, or even the term passing. We often talk about someone who passes away, or when people talk about someone who crossed over. Even the language itself sort of sounds like someone who has died. And I think that there's a reason for that, because I think in some cases that is what that feels like. That is what that kind of can mean to some family members.
You told a story about Elsie Roxborough, who dated Joe Louis and Langston Hughes and started passing, but she was the first student at the University of Michigan, first black student in the dorms. Would you go on?
Yeah, I think this is probably one of the most tragic stories, and I'll show you, let me show you some pictures of Elsie Roxborough. This was one of the most tragic stories that I found. So Elsie Roxborough was born to a legendary African-American family. They lived in Detroit. Her father was, now I'm gonna get this wrong. I think her father was Joe Louis's manager, or her uncle
Yes,
was Joe Louis's manager. So they dated for a while, but then I think her family felt like he wasn't quite, even though he was very famous, he didn't have kind of the class that someone should have to date Elsie Roxborough. So she went to the University of Michigan. I should just say that the family lived a life that few black or white people could imagine during the Depression. So Elsie drove her father's cars, she rode horseback, they vacationed in Idlewild, which was a black resort where other black elites vacationed in western Michigan. And you know, they had this very they were incredibly wealthy. They had maids and chauffeurs, but she was very unhappy, and she was very close to Langston Hughes, and she would often write to him and talk about, well, maybe if I were to pass as white, I might be able to sort of find my dreams. You know, I might be able to live my dreams. So she did go to the University of Michigan. After she graduated from the University of Michigan, she moved to California. She started to pass there. Things did not go that well for her in California, so she decided to move to New York. Once she got to New York, she dyed her brown hair red, and she dropped the famous Roxborough name and became the unattached Mona Manet. And this is what she looked like when she was passing as white in New York. So she continued to stay in touch with Langston Hughes, but after a while, her letters to Langston Hughes became fewer and fewer, and eventually they kind of ended altogether, and that's when he knew that she was passing. So the really sad thing is that she ended up committing suicide in 1949. And what happened was her white roommate returned from a weekend trip and found her in her bed. And it appeared that she had committed suicide. So her sister, who could also pass as white, but who did not pass as white, traveled to New York with the horrible assignment of collecting Elsie's body, because by having this this ostensibly white sister come to New York to collect the body, it allowed Elsie to remain white even in death. And Elsie had some financial trouble. She had asked her father for money. He refused her, and 3 days later she was dead. And the thing that makes this story so tragic and so sad is that you really have to kind of speculate about what was really missing from her life, you know, because she had such privilege. She was so beautiful, so she was known when she was at University of Michigan, you know, it was like every man on campus was in love with her, from Arthur Miller, the future playwright, to Langston Hughes, you know, Joe Louis, as you mentioned, you know, so it's a really sort of difficult story to kind of unpack, because she had such privilege, but yet in the archives that I read, there was a lot of discussion about how the family was not very close, and you know that there were some problems in the family, but you know we don't quite know exactly what happened.
That period of time is so interesting to me because as you talked about Reconstruction being a time of opportunity, the Harlem Renaissance was also a time of opportunity.
Yeah.
And writers like Langston Hughes, Nella Larson, and Jean Toomer all made different decisions about how they were going to deal with that opportunity, whether or not to pass. Would you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, the Harlem Renaissance is so interesting because it is this sort of opening where a lot of writers are talking and artists are talking about race in new ways. And exactly as you've said, they're all sort of looking at race differently, and in many ways they're doing it based on their own experience. It's also really important to note that during the 1920s, there's kind of an explosion of interest in passing in general. So Black authors are very interested in passing, but white authors are very interested in passing too. So this is when William Faulkner writes Light in August. This is when Edna Ferber writes Showboat. It doesn't become a play until the 30s, but she writes it then. So there's a lot of interest and a lot of discussion about passing during this period. So probably some of the most famous novels that come out of this period are Nella Larson writes a novel called Passing. And then Langston Hughes writes a lot of poetry about passing. But one thing that's very interesting is that I read through a lot of the correspondence of many of the writers and the authors during the Harlem Renaissance that is at Yale in the Beinecke Library. And many of those writers are just fascinated by the idea of people passing. So, you know, Nella Larson will write to a friend, you know, I saw Harry, he's passing. you know, and then 2 weeks later, someone will write back, I saw Harry too, he's passing. You know, and it's almost like you could imagine in today's world, it would be like a group text, you know, or like an urgent email, like 3 red exclamation points, like this person is passing, which sort of makes sense because that was a big, I mean, it was a big deal, you know, and it was like that person probably had to ignore, you know, Nella, or ignore her correspondent, and you know, it was something surprising, and so it definitely came up a lot in the correspondence, which then makes sense that it would come up in the literature. So that was actually one way that I started writing this book, by reading the correspondence of some of these authors who I knew had written novels about passing, and seeing, you know, what was coming up for them in their own lives. And there's just one, I'll show you, there's one interesting letter that Nella Larson writes to Carl Van Vechten. And it's a story where she and Grace Nail Johnson, who is the very light-skinned wife of James Weldon Johnson, who writes the autobiography of the Next Colored Man, they go to a restaurant, and she writes to Carl Van Vechten, and she says, "You will be amused that I, who have never tried this much discussed passing stunt, have waited until I reached the deep south to put it over. Grace Johnson and I drove about 50 miles south of here the other day, and then walked to the best restaurant in a rather conservative town called Murfreesboro, and demanded lunch and got it, plus all the service in the world and an invitation to return. Everybody here seems to think that quite a stunt." So there really was a lot of like intrigue and, you know, kind of excitement about passing, and could you do it? Could you sort of like get over on white folks? Like Langston Hughes used to talk a lot about like fooling our white folks, and sort of the fun and kind of the sort of joy of getting over. So you also see these kinds of letters in the archives as well. And to bring in Gene Toomer, he's another very interesting figure in that he actually is, I mean, we could almost think of him as being a kind of leader in a sort of mixed race movement, because he's really far ahead of his time in making an argument about not being black or white, but being like a new American, or being, I know he would use words like, I'm a new American, I am not, like, to call me black or white is to lose me, like I'm more than just black or white. He didn't want to be known as like the great new Negro writer. James Weldon Johnson was putting together an anthology of young Negro poets, and Toomer did not want to be included in it, and he wrote him this really lengthy explanation about why not, and explained that, you know, he was of mixed race, and, you know, and explained what that meant, and
And he believed in racelessness. That was his sort of catchphrase for where he was going. Whereas an actress you write about absolutely was not into passing, even as she played a woman in the film Imitation of Life, Freddie Washington. Would you talk about her?
Sure, yeah. So Freddie Washington is a really fascinating figure because she's in Imitation of Life in 1934, so she's in the first version of it. Probably the 1959 version is a little bit more popular with Sandra Day. I think the 1934 version is like 50 times better, personally. And partially why I love the 1934 version is because of Freddie Washington, because the 1934 version is one of the only versions where a black actress plays the character who's passing as white. And it's really interesting to kind of think about the issues that are going on now in Hollywood and how the same issues were going on back then, because during that time there was the same idea of, well, if we cast a black actress, we won't get as many people coming to the movie theater, we won't get as much sympathy for the character, you know, we need a bigger name and all of this kind of thing. But Freddie Washington just, I mean, really just like kills it, as the young folks would say, right? I mean, so what's interesting is that she's so good that people who see the film actually believe that Freddie Washington herself passed as white. So I read through Freddie Washington's papers, and she gets all of this fan mail from people who are like, oh, I totally get it, you know, I pass too. It's just something that like, some of us have to do. And Freddie Washington is a real activist. I mean, she feels really strongly about not passing, and she never has passed. Actually, that's not true. She would pass because she also was an actress and a singer. She would pass when so she performed with Duke Ellington's orchestra. She would pass and like get food for Duke Ellington's orchestra at places where they would not allow blacks to eat. Or she would pass and get a hotel room for the band, and then, you know, because people would assume that she was white, and that, so she would do like strategic passing like that. But otherwise, she would not pass.
This way, please.
This must be the place. There she is, Miss B.
How do you like your new job?
Amen, thank you. Thank you.
Now give me one of those. What can I do for you?
Viola, we've been looking everywhere for you. Are you talking to me? There must be some mistake. My name isn't Viola. There ain't no mistake. Why have you got this job? You don't have to work. I'll give you everything you want. What are you talking about? I'm sure you've got me confused with someone else. Why, Viola, child, I'm your mammy. Why, that's ridiculous. I never saw you before in my life.
What's the meaning of this?
This woman doesn't know what she's talking about. Do I look like her daughter? Do I look like I could be her daughter? Well, she must be crazy. Viola, how can you talk to your mother that way? Come on, Delilah. Come on.
So the one interesting thing is that in the reviews, for those of you who know the story of Imitation of Life, this is not really a spoiler alert, because, well, it kind of is, but the mother dies at the end, and it's sort of like she dies of a broken heart because the daughter has left her, you know. And in most of the reviews, there's this sense of, you know, how could this daughter do this? This is such a horrible thing for the daughter to leave the mother, and that the daughter has basically killed her mother. And there was one review that I found in 1934 where the reviewer said that Freddie Washington was so powerful that she actually made you have sympathy for her character instead of feeling that she was the villain who had killed her mother, that you felt sympathy for her and the difficulty that she was going through and the injustice that blacks were facing by having to, like, go through back doors and all the limitations that there were on blacks' careers and economic opportunities and all of the kind of social slights. And, you know, so it was interesting that, like, there was one person in 1934 who got it, you know, which I don't even think is what the director, right?
Yeah. I'd like to open it up now to all of you and your questions. You have a microphone? The microphone is coming. Yes. The microphone's coming in.
Thank you. This is a topic I've explored throughout my life. My family has various shades and colors. My father's right next to me, who's 96, who had aunts in New York and D.C. who he would visit after the war. So we got to hang out with, go to, do a smelling fight and hang out with Duke Ellington's band during that period when, after a four, he'd be 25 to 35, where you could just be a young single man hanging out in L.A., New York, and D.C. So since he's moved up here, I'm trying to get his perspective on different things, especially as an army, they were stationed in Fort Belvoir, where they, for years, where they trained the troops who were not allowed to fight. Now, of course, if you passed as white, you could go to the front lines immediately. It always was a clue to me as when they went in on D-Day, why they did not send in the black troops first. I was really shocked at that. At Morehouse, we would discuss a lot about how, as men, we had a little bit more privilege in terms of race passing. As if you were light, you could jump back and forth a little bit more than females can. Or if you were dark and were privileged through intellect or ability or educational attainment, if you were Benjamin Mays or Nat King Cole, your color did not mean as much. You could date dark women, light women, foreign women. It did not matter as much. And our choice of presidents, Walter White, I'm sure, got the NAACP further along looking like a white man than he would have if he were a darker man.
Thank you.
My name is Marcia Russell, and I just like to say make a couple of comments. I agree with you when you said that they passed, but not really all the time, because they probably had to move away. Because a black person can always find another black person. I mean, that's just it. It's either the hair, it's the skin tone, or the feature. I mean, you would have to move away. I mean, black people don't, because people still do it, don't have the luxury of being like Rachel Dolezal and going back. You know, we are what we are, and everybody can't do it. The second thing I'd like to agree with you on as far as racial identity, I think it is bankrupt, but for a different reason. I have a biracial son, and I have raised him as black, and I told it just so he wouldn't have an identity issue, and also because I've noticed how when he was young and he would go to school, before people saw me, they looked at him in a different way. But then when he called me mama, then the whole demeanor changed. And they viewed him in a different way, and myself too, because I had a biracial child. So to make it easier for him, you're black, because unless you disown me, that's how it's gonna be. So. But it is bankrupt. I mean, when you go and you apply for a job and they have all these boxes for you to check, it's ludicrous. It's ludicrous.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm in the back, right. Yes, sir. Ma'am.
Hi. I have an ancestor, I guess it's my second great grandmother, whose marriage certificate in 1868 says she's white. However, she lived black. Later, her death certificate and other documents say that she was black. But at least one of her children passed as white. And I was just fascinated by your book title about making choices, because it's something I had thought about before. It's almost like if somebody really did look white, despite, and I know it's all complicated, then they had a choice to make. And you talked about the term passing, like passing through, passing over, stepping over, pretending. So I'm starting to think passing is kind of a misnomer, and I'd like you to comment about that. The other piece is, I have a cousin who recently was at the doctor, and the doctor said to her, and I'm just telling this quick story, it's more to it, said, you usually see this in people of Scotch-Irish descent, whatever condition she had. And the fact is, we do have some Scotch-Irish descent. And so nowadays, it seems like, some lady over here mentioned how we check all these different races and so on. But if we appear black and only check black on the forms when we go to the doctor, they might miss some of the conditions we have. And it can go the other way. I have a friend, some of you might have heard of him, his name is Shannon Lanier. He's one of the black descendants of Thomas Jefferson. And he's written a book titled Jefferson's Children. And in this book, which is actually geared to his children, it's a real easy read if anybody wants to get it. But he shows very clearly how you can be black and descended from white and white descended from black. Largely because it's the black folks who passed a long time ago. So it's super complicated. And so I'd like you to comment about some of that.
Thank you.
Those are great questions. So now, when you say is passing a misnomer, do you mean that a better word might be presenting, or a better word might be like what do you think would be a more like apt word, like a more fitting or a more appropriate word?
Okay, that's a really good question. I don't consider myself a wordsmith.
It's your question.
It's my question. I feel like I'm here with the expert. Some other people are, but it's something I'm somewhat recently starting to think about, and it's partially because, and here's another part of the story. I don't want to take it over, but I'm on Ancestry.com, as many people are, and I got an email from a person he had downloaded a picture of another one of my ancestors. And I didn't know this person's name, but on Ancestry they give you the people's name. So I wrote to him, and subsequently we had talked and so on. But it turns out he's not a relative of mine, but he's helping someone who is a relative of mine who happens to be descended from one of those who passed as white. I haven't met her. I know some other people in the family. Again, it's kind of a long story, but it made me start thinking about, okay, these people who passed as white, by the way, I have people on another side of my family who I understand passed as white as well. So it's like people make the choice. Presented is as good a word as any, but maybe some of the other people here have some other suggestions. That's what I'm looking for answers.
I think that's an excellent question, and I think the reason why I used passing was because that's what the people of the time used. So in the book I used passing, crossed over, crossing the line. I use whatever the people in the archives used. And I felt that if I were to introduce a new word, then it would be more confusing to people, because a lot of people aren't familiar with passing. So I was kind of worried, like if I say presenting, then people might be like, what's that? You know what I mean? So, but I do think that the problem with passing is that it almost like re-inscribes the hierarchy of black and white. You know what I mean? Like it almost like, it almost, well, first of all, it does sort of reinscribe a black-white hierarchy and a black-white binary too. You know what I mean? Whereas like now we're in a much more multiracial world. So I think passing is not, like the word passing might pass away. You know what I mean? Because eventually people won't think about that phenomenon, or maybe we'll just think about it as like a historical phenomenon. I don't know. Who knows? Maybe we will, maybe we won't. But yeah, but it's a really good question. And then you had one other question about
Because of time.
I saw some more hands.
I just heard you say multiracial. I say there's white, black, brown, yellow, and red. I mean, what's multiracial? I don't understand that.
Somebody with all those colors.
No, but usually, well, I'm saying, I'm sounding like I'm being, facetious a little bit, but I am being facetious in that if you have one drop of black blood, you black. Isn't that the truth? Isn't it? If you have one drop of brown, you're brown. I mean, that's the way this society has been from the very beginning. I don't understand multiracial. I don't understand the multi levels of racial thing, whatever it was that you said. I'm not trying to down you or anything like that. I'm just saying what I see in America says, if you have one drop of black blood, you're black. And so black is black, brown, yellow, red, and what I named one other, so.
What are Arabs?
Excuse me?
What are
White.
Arabs?
White. They are
Arabs are
considered,
white?
yes. If you do some research,
I have.
okay, they are considered white. They consider themselves white. Latinos consider themselves white. Okay? If you're from the Dominican Republic, you are white. Even though you look black, you got the big lips and the nose and everything, they're considered white. All right? People classify themselves based on privilege. What they see, who they see, gets the privilege. Okay?
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
I'd love to say something. I want to let you respond first. Do you want to say something?
Well, I think that we are moving into a much more multiracial.
That's
Well,
what they said about Barack Obama. Where is it?
well, I think partially it's happening because of immigration. I think there's a number of reasons. I mean, I think it goes back to, like, I think in large numbers, it's changed since the 60s, when the immigration laws changed, and when our society, when we started to, change, like we had a quota system, which we got rid of, so we now
I
have.
don't need all of that. I'm just saying, as a person today, I don't need all about the immigration, I know that, I'm a lawyer. I'm just saying that today, when you look at a person today, they will either classify themselves for you, or you will classify them. And it's 5 things. They're either black, white, brown, red, or yellow, one or the other.
Well, more and more because of intermarriage, because of interracial marriage and interracial, like, I think because there's more interracial marriage and there's more interracial children. And as that continues, I think that it's not as the categories aren't as
Strict, right, as they used to be.
yeah.
We have a question over here.
Okay, I'm going to commit a very unnatural act for me. I'm going to try to be brief, especially on this topic. My research tells me that, for one thing, the Census Bureau, which asks us all what our race is, has changed every 10 years. The boxes have changed, categories have changed. In fact, till about 1880, the boxes included octoroon and quadroon. You know what those are? 1/4 or 1/8 black. The one drop rule came in the time of slavery because slave masters wanted more slaves. Very obvious. I haven't been able to find a one drop rule anywhere else on the planet except in Nazi Germany. Under the old republic, they went around. They said, "You have one drop of Jewish blood, you're a Jew." Malcolm X said, "One drop rule shows how special we are, because if it's one drop, that whole bucket of ink, or it's kind of like having a whole bucket of milk, one drop of ink, right?" Said that's some powerful blood. But this is a reality. We have. What gets me is that today it's black folks defending the one drop rule because we want more black folks. And there was a big fight.
We want
back.
our children to
Please,
love
I let you
themselves.
finish.
Yeah.
I'll let you finish. I do the McLaughlin group, so I know how to handle introductions. During the 80s and 90s, there was a big argument over should we allow more than one box to be checked on the census. And what happened? 2000, they finally did. But before that, there was a big argument, including some members of the Congressional Black Caucus, said we can't do that. We're going to lose black folks. People are going to be checking multiple black boxes, blah, blah, blah. As it turns out, they predicted there would be 2.5% would check more than one box. When they finally did it, 5%, so twice as many as expected. But still, we got black folks. We haven't disappeared. I think that what we really talk about is, you talk about another label. This may not catch on, but what gets me is the phrase identify as. And I thought of this because of the LGBT issues.
Yes.
How do you identify? What's that new law they passed down in North Carolina that said that whatever you were born with, what your birth certificate says? Well, we know from black experience that doesn't always work either, right? There are numerous stories and anecdotes. But my real question I wanted to ask you, though, you brought up Rachel Dolezal. I wonder, how do you feel about Rachel Dolezal? Did you ever think you would live to see a white person passing for black? And I preface that by saying, I know of one in our neighborhood, where I grew up in small town Ohio. We had in our neighborhood was almost all black. The local funeral home. The owner of the funeral home had a wife who was very light-skinned. And when she passed away, and her family came to the funeral, they were all white folks. And it dawned on us, but she has been passing for black to live in the community without any disruption or whatever. This is the first time, and people have known her for decades, and I never heard that anybody, she might not be black. But, knows what do you identify as, this is the way folks seem to feel. I view race as less important than culture and class, frankly, because, what are your shared values? And black folks do have a certain set of shared values. And, people talk about self-segregation, they saw down in, I remember 60 Minutes did a story about segregation on campus. They were down at the University of North Carolina or Duke, one or the other. And they were showing folks, the football team was segregating themselves on the team buses. They had a white bus and a black bus. And folks were shaking their heads saying, isn't this terrible, segregating themselves? But then the members of the team said, no, that bus plays disco, this one plays country and western. It was the music that played on the bus that caused people to segregate themselves.
So your question is,
No, my question is, Rachel Dolezal, how do you feel about her and that? What does it say about our current era that we have a woman who passed for black and was head of the local NAACP chapter?
I have a position on Rachel Dolezal that most people don't agree with. I actually have a little bit of sympathy for her. And I always get a little nervous when I share this because I was giving a talk once and it was going really well. And people were laughing and everything was happy. And then someone asked a question about Rachel Dolezal, and I was lucky to pass up my computer. I think I left without the cord. And after and just left. Yeah, got an Uber and got there. I feel that we don't really know her full story. I think that she has a very complicated life. I think that there are some complexity with her family that we don't know about. I think there's some major complexity with the adopted children that we don't know about. I think that I felt that there was a rush to judge her and to really criticize her that was a little premature. And my feeling about her is I don't think she should have lied. I think it would have been much better if she had just come out and said, you know what, I know this isn't the way society defines me, but I personally see myself as a black woman. Like, I think that if she had just been a little bit clearer about, I get that this is not what society thinks, but this is how I see myself, and then that would have been better. But I think for me, and part of this is that I've been reading and really kind of moved or deeply moved by Brian Stevenson's work, he works on death row. He works with people who are on death row. He has a book out called Just Mercy. And his whole idea is about getting close to people, about how if you really want to solve a problem, you have to get close to people. Like you can't just like hold people at arm's length. You gotta like get right up to them. And I don't know if Rachel Dolezal did this, like maybe I'm taking it too far with her, but I feel like, what if more white people got closer to black people? And what if more black people got closer to white people? I mean, you know what I mean? Like what if when Trayvon Martin was murdered, more white people said, you know, he could have been my son? Or what if when Michael Brown was murdered? Or what if when any of those horrible cases, white people had said, and not to say that not any white people did this, but to say like if more people had felt like I'm gonna get close to that murder and I'm gonna feel like he could have been my son, like that could have had a profound impact. And I'm not saying that she did that, but like what if she did? Like what if that's, what if there was something like that beneath her? You know? Like that could be profound. And I just feel like there was such a rush to judge her that we don't know what could have been behind it. And I think that for me, all I know is that it seems like she came from a very problematic family, and I mean, and talk about passing, I mean, she that's the real thing that separates her from black people who passed is that no one's parents ever outed a black person who passed, right? I mean, that's so, like, just that whole thing was so odd. And then, but I do get all of the critiques of her. You know, I do get that she could any day turn around and say, I'm not going to do this anymore. I do get, though you know, she hasn't done that, but she could. I do get that there's that it sort of has that whiff of appropriation. I mean, I get all of the problems with it, but I also think, like, what if there could be this possibility for something positive with her?
There's also humor in it. Yeah, I mean, she fooled the black folks too.
Yeah.
That's pretty good, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, also, apparently she was in no hurry to just be black or just be white. It was what she was out and it turned out. But she's got a book like that now. We'll find out the truth.
Yeah.
Hi, I have a question. Hi, how are you? What are your views and your thoughts about blacks that are passing today in 2016? Back then, I know that there's a part of it that the blacks that were doing that back then were trying to survive on some level. And then given now with all of, like, you know, everything that's happened and all the immigration and multiculturalism and everything else, how do you feel about that? Because I have a friend, or had a friend who, black woman whose mother was white, father was black, and she passed for white, and she struggled with that. So how do you feel about blacks who are passing now and choosing to pass now?
You know, when I was writing this book, I was very careful not to put a label on people who had like one black parent and one white parent, because like I only wanted to sort of look at people who like identified as black and then made a deliberate decision to pass as white. because I was I wanted to make sure that I wasn't reading their identity onto them, you know? So, I mean, I guess I wouldn't know what to say about somebody who's passing now. Like, I don't know if passing would even be the right word to use, or the right, you know, is that the right language? Like, I mean, I would be interested in, you know, what decisions are they making about their identity? What's behind those decisions? Like, I think I would be more interested in those decisions and less like able to make any kind of
No, I'm just listening.
oh no, 'cause it looked like I didn't know what I was gonna say, and it
Yeah,
looked like
assumptions about it.
yeah, exactly.
Right.
I was like, I think she's mouthing the words that I want. Yeah, like it would be harder for me to make an assumption, but then like you're saying that she's conflicted about it?
Well, I mean, her family kind of raised her in a certain way. Her father did, and so when we became friends, you know, obviously, you know, I was like, hey, you can't hang out with me if you're, you know, I have to. So I cultured her, but we used to talk about it all the time. That she found certain advantages, you know, if she didn't say what her race was.
Yeah.
And there was an acceptance there, and she battled that internally for a really long time. So I know that there are blacks who are continuously, or nowadays are still fighting, or battling with that. So I just didn't know.
Thank you. So one more question.
It's really complicated. I mean, you know, it's really complicated because I think we don't want to believe, like I think we want to think that like you really don't have to pass, or that like the road, like that it is even, and then you realize like there still are these advantages, but then at the same time it sounds like there's still like these heavy emotional tolls.
And disadvantages, right?
Yeah.
Got one more back here.
Yes, since the conversation has passed from history to the present, I think I could tie up a few of the loose ends. And that is, there are documented as well as undocumented cases of non-black people, white people passing for black. And I did know one back in Buffalo whose name was Kowalski, and he was black as far as everybody was concerned. He wasn't even faking it. Now wait a minute, and here's the difference. This also connects to the concept of passing, because if you think of passing, for example, as a border between two countries, with a barrier between the two, and you're at the border, you've got to show a passport. If you have a valid passport, you get to the other side. You're either on one side or you're the other. That was the past. And so therefore, if a white person was passing as black in those days, you were either on one side or the other. And it actually did happen in a few cases. You know, it wasn't a fluid situation. Now, if you look at the present, I mean, for me, Rachel Doll is always comedy, regardless of what her personal motivations are, honest or not. To me, it's like theater of the absurd, for the simple reason that now you're in a situation where you have black people who, culturally speaking, are in a much more diverse environment, some of them, than they would have been in the past. Plus, there are the people classified as biracial, or whatever they're classified as, who, again, if they're fortunate, they live in an environment where they don't have to just belong to one group or the other. So if they live in a less rigid environment, why would somebody who originally was classified as white actually have to pretend to be black in order to be in a diverse environment, or even to identify with black culture or black people, as people have been doing for the past 100 years or more, without trying to pass as black? So for me, regardless of her sincerity, I do think it's like theater of the absurd, like she's doing something that's historically obsolete. That when Mesro did this in the 1920s, he did it because it was a rigid barrier. You had to be one or the other. But for Rachel, is it really necessary? My daughter does not think of herself as white, never will. And I don't know if she thinks of herself as black. I don't even know if it matters, but she sure as hell doesn't think of herself as white. She probably doesn't think of me either, because I have such a negative attitude towards what's going on around me in the society. And so a newer generation in different circumstances has nothing in common with their parents, their grandparents, or their great-grandparents. They live in a different cultural environment, many of them. And for some people, it's not just one thing or the other, which is actually kind of boring and getting kind of tiresome. It's a different situation, even though we're not equal, and people are going to be pigeonholed and subject to violence and discrimination. So we're in a different situation where this one drop rule business really is becoming obsolete, and even for those who are unambiguously identified as black, like my stepdaughter. What does that actually mean for a person whose pattern of associations is completely diverse? You know, the passing means when you have a rigid boundary, and it's one or the other. And I think that aside from the loss of the family and pretending you don't know people that you know, it's also that you live an underground psychological existence. The inner self and the outer self are two different things. You know things that you can't tell people around you. You're psychologically isolated from an environment. And many of us experience this even without the racial division, where the inner self and the outer self don't match, and we're hostile to the world around us because it is hostile to us.
Thank you, sir, so much.
Yeah,
And
that's a great way to end.
real, and thanks to all of you for coming out. Really appreciate your making room in this beautiful day for our time with Allyson Hobbs.
On behalf of the Hill Center, again, thank you all for coming out and thank you for a wonderful discussion. Please take time out to fill out your evaluation forms. Those mean a lot to me. And also, if you have time at 6 o'clock, we're having a closing concert at Christ Church, which is about 2 blocks away, and it's going to be phenomenal, just like this panel. One more time for our discussion.